Back in the mid-1960s, the ratio of CEO compensation to the average employee was about 15. For every dollar the average employee made, the CEO made $15. Today, CEO compensation has ballooned by over 1,000%, and in the top 250 firms in the US, CEOs regularly make more than 200, 300, sometimes 400 times more than the average employee. That's a massive gap, which a lot of people are having a very hard time reconciling. Since 1978, salaries have increased by over 1,000% for CEOs, where it's much, much less for the typical worker. I'm Mike. I've got 25 years background in business from pharma, tech, and consulting. I've held C-level roles in human resources in international companies. I have degrees in business, human resources, and psychology. On this channel, I cover business and careers. I analyze and pick apart why companies do the things they do. And I provide advice on careers and navigating the corporate world. Today, the focus is on CEOs, their pay, and whether or not they're worth it. We're asking the questions: what do CEOs actually do? How we ended up here in terms of compensation? How does their compensation get set? And are they really worth 200, 300, 400 times more than the average employee? Let's get stuck in. The CEO is the head of the business. More often than not, they are accountable to some sort of board structure that oversees the long-term interests of the business. But the day-to-day running of the business is in the CEO's wheelhouse. Together with their executive management team, the CEO sets out the strategy for the business. They identify high-level priorities, and they orchestrate that high-level actions and decisions that need to be made are made to ensure that the company gets from A to B. These days, some CEOs have almost demigod-like status. From the Zuckerbergs to the Musks to the Bezoses, and some years back even the Steve Jobses of this world, that seemingly are involved in every single minute aspect of their business. They are painted as indispensable and instrumental in creating successful businesses. While they are important, most CEOs are usually incredibly dependent on the team around them. They are not the single source of ideas, direction, and strategy. Egon Zehnder, a global leading executive search firm, describes the CEO as the catalyst for change and the orchestrator of the symphony. Now that sounds sexy, but basically their job above all else is to ensure that the team around them are aligned on where they want to go, what they need to do, and ensure that they actually do it. They need to be reasonably smart, they have to know and understand the business, and then they need to build relationships internally and externally that lead to things getting done. Now, I'm no CEO, I just have a YouTube channel, and my goal is to have as many subscribers and as many people that see my videos as possible. And the way you tell me that this was a good video is by subscribing. So if you enjoyed the content, please click the subscribe button. Thank you. Tim Cook of Apple provides a really good example of what a CEO brings to the table. Prior to Tim Cook, Apple was headed by Steve Jobs, and the two men could not have been more different. Jobs was by most people described as an entrepreneurial individual with all eyes set on the product and the customer experience. His obsession with the product itself was legendary, and many wondered if Tim Cook, ostensibly a supply chain guy, could take over Jobs' mantle. But Tim Cook has taken Apple to whole new heights, and it hasn't necessarily been because of cutting-edge tech and product innovation. The Apple VR headset is largely seen as a failure. The new product categories introduced under Tim Cook are nowhere near as cutting edge or as leading edge as the ones introduced under the Steve Jobs tenure. There have been few new product categories, and the expectations of what new thing will Apple do next are not really there anymore. But Cook has ensured a transition to a vastly more robust supply chain. Each year, Apple's silicon gets more efficient and more powerful, and profits have soared. This back-end focus on supply chains and product improvement is what Cook has brought to the table. Somebody else around him came up with the products. The point I'm attempting to make is that just like everyone else in the business, a CEO brings a mix of experience and knowledge to the table that sets the tone and the priorities for the business. From there, their key skill is being able to orchestrate that the rest of the organization executes on the plan set in place. Incidentally, Tim Cook's salary is $70 million per year. How did we end up here? CEO compensation has been ballooning globally for decades. There's no doubt about that. But it is especially in the US that the disparity between the CEO's pay and the average employee's pay is consistently the greatest. In the 1970s, CEO compensation was around 30 times that of a regular employee. Around the 90s, it was around 60, and today it's easily over 200, and more often than not, in the US, it's over 300 or 400. One of the key factors driving this acceleration was a simple change in tax law that put a cap on tax deductibility of executive salaries. And as Charlie Munger once said, show me an incentive and I'll show you the consequences. From then on, companies started relying much more on stock options and equity as a part of executive compensation. In the US, the share of executive compensation that is tied to long-term incentives, so equity, stock, that kind of stuff, is much higher than the ratio in most Japanese or even European firms, although the trend is there as well. On paper, this makes sense. In part, the CEO's job is to ensure the maximizing of shareholder value, and in theory at least, a company that does well will see stock prices go up, and that subsequently leads to the CEO getting a, on paper, fair reward. When the company does badly, stocks go down, and the CEO earns less. But this is where it started. Equity got thrown into the mix at the same time as one other thing started to become much more popular: benchmarking. The sophistication in benchmarking of CEO salaries has accelerated since the 80s, and experts agree that this has led to a race to the top. In the fight for talent, no one wants to underpay in what is often seen as the most important company role. So salaries have consistently crept up, and as one record is broken, a new CEO stands in line demanding a comparable package to that record that was just set. Since 2021, Pfizer's stock has dropped from a high of almost $60 to around $22 today. In 2023, they made mistakes about the demand for COVID vaccines, and this meant that their CEO only made $21.4 million that year. The following year, he apparently fixed everything and went up to $24.6 million. Every year, for every well-performing company and corresponding CEO, there's a litany of companies and CEOs that underwhelm massively, and yet they still make millions upon millions of dollars, even in those terrible years. So how do those salaries get set? What is it made up of? The first thing to understand about CEO compensation is to understand what it's usually made up of in general. Traditionally, you have three components. You have the base salary, which is just a simple paycheck every month. Then there's typically a short-term incentive, a bonus scheme, which is linked to specific company objectives: employee engagement, revenue growth, bottom line performance, real numbers that say something about the company's in-year performance. Lastly, you have the equity, which is usually on some sort of vesting schedule. Each year, the board will give the executive a grant which vests over typically a 3 or 4 year period. There are different models for this. There are RSUs and VSOs and all sorts of other stuff that I'm not going to get into, but the simple explanation is that they're tied to the stock price or some other valuation of the company. The obvious difference of the executive compensation is, of course, the overall size of the compensation, but more importantly, there are two more things to be aware of. The role of variable compensation is much, much higher than other employees. Where a high-level software engineer might get a 20% bonus, the CEO is potentially aiming for a target of 50% or 70% or higher. When it comes to equity, it's also the case that it can potentially be more than double the base salary, or even more. In Europe, Willis Towers Watson states that a typical mix is 30% base, 30% short-term, and 30% equity. In the US, Harvard Business Review estimates that long-term incentives make up over 80% of total executive compensation. A huge proportion of salary is variable, and this is where we get to the problems cropping up. Problem number one. Forbes magazine says this clearly. Stock performance is not entirely a reflection of a company's isolated performance. Overall market performance and macroeconomic factors directly affect a stock's value. At the time of this video, most of the stocks in the US are down, and none of it is directly connected to anything any particular CEO did. They're down because an American administration and its approach to foreign relations and the implementation of tariffs. Assuming the numbers from the Harvard Business Review report, CEOs' compensation can fluctuate wildly, entirely independently of the CEO's actual contribution to the business. The CEO, generally, in the last 30 years has benefited massively, primarily from an upwardly trending stock market. As Forbes state, the compensation of chief executives is not necessarily tied to improved individual productivity or company performance. Instead, it's heavily influenced by broader market trends. Your CEO can suck, but if the market is up in general, they're still getting a big bonus. And even when their compensation is down, they can wait to cash in a lot of those shares until the market is back up again. Problem two. The goal of compensation, on paper at least, is to incentivize a behavior that leads to a business that is profitable in the short term and the long term. The reality, though, has proven to be that if your compensation is 80% variable, of which 70% is linked to equity, there is an incentive to engage in behaviors that focus on optimizing equity value and not optimizing business robustness. You know the examples. Firing people in tech is seen as a way to boost investor confidence, and that drives up shares. Offshoring, although often fraught with complexities and inefficiencies for a lot of companies, also tends to drive up share prices. From a compensation perspective, having a goal of incentivizing long-term focus is generally seen as a good thing. But equity has consistently proven to be a flawed instrument, sometimes not only driving the wrong behaviors and not being a particularly good reflection of the CEO and the executive management team's ability to create a robust business. I love that Charlie Munger quote because Incentives do drive behavior, and if you have a CEO and a management team whose compensation is massively dependent on equity performance, they are definitely incentivized to make business decisions that pump the value of their own equity. I've seen salespeople not book a sale in the current financial year because they'd already hit the target for the year and the payout curve for overperformance was just not attractive enough. So they waited to book the sale until the next financial year. I've seen salespeople give discounts to hit volume targets because profitability was not part of their metrics. I've seen tech staff rush to launch faulty software because there was a penalty in their incentives for missing launch dates. CEOs also will do things to pump the stocks if it means they get paid more. It's human nature. Problems 3, 4, and 5 are all connected. A problem with highly variable equity-based compensation rears its head because boards and candidates are forced into flawed benchmarking. All too often, there's a tendency to bake overperformance into the target. Take 2 scenarios. Scenario 1 is an employee with 80% fixed salary and 20% variable. 8 million in base and 2 million in bonus, essentially. If the employee does really well, he might make 4 million in bonus, so 12 million in total. That's a lot, but not compared to the other scenario. In scenario 2, the base is 5 million. The LTI is 5 million. Same comp, 10 million as a target. But when this person outperforms, they get 15 million in total. So a doubling of the variable, just like scenario 1, but it still lands this person 3 million more than scenario 1. Now, if you're some other company looking to attract a CEO from the company in scenario 2, what's that CEO going to say in the salary negotiation? Is he going to say, sure, I'll take a pay cut down to 10 million? Or is he going to aim for his new target to be 15? Of course he is. I've been in conversations with executives that we needed to move from some other company that had a massive equity ratio where their equity had outperformed. To attract those candidates, we had to pump our base and our variable to bridge at least some of the gap. Over time, this behavior of baking in overperformance into the target simply inflates salaries. It just mushrooms.
When you have boards, Warren Buffett, for example, said he's been on 19 boards over 55 years and never seen a board vote down a compensation package.
Oh, I'm sure that's quite accurate.
Related to problem 3 is the fact that firms generally at this level do not want to be seen as not hiring the best person. And this inevitably leads to an over-aggressive stance on compensation. Where a lot of normal employees get the feeling that the company is trying to aggressively keep people within the pay bands, the tendency is the opposite at the high end. There's just less incentive and willingness to challenge a candidate on compensation when the role is that all too important CEO role. Problem 5 is the football problem, or soccer for you Americans. This is Cristiano Ronaldo. He and Lionel Messi are among the best footballers of all time. They were crucial to the success of the clubs they played for. Lionel Messi, at his peak, earned more than $130 million a year from his club Barcelona. In that time, Barcelona had packed stadiums, multiple trophies, earned tons on game transmissions, and also sold a ton of t-shirts. The problem is, it's generally agreed that there are, at least in part, some footballers who have benefited disproportionately from the existence of Cristiano Ronaldo and Lionel Messi. We're not talking about a Neymar, but rather the lesser tier of footballers who likely are not objectively worth 5 or 10 or 20 million a year, but make it because they are playing on a team and in a league where everybody else is making 5 or 10 or 20 million a year. Superstar wages seem in general to be justified considering the superstar's contributions, but the rising tide has raised all boats. Also the boats that are good, but maybe not 20 million a year good. Forbes, Harvard Business Review, Willis, Zender all point to this.
You start paying directors of corporations $200,000 or $300,000 a year. It creates a daisy chain of reciprocity where they keep raising the CEO and he keeps recommending more pay for the directors. And in the end, I think the pay of both CEOs and directors in this country, in the biggest corporations, I think the pay is too high.
The active exercise of transparent benchmarking, general high transparency, and competition for talent leads boards to offer exorbitant and skewed salaries to individuals that likely aren't really worth it. Problem number 6 is that in the grander scheme of things, it's not that much money. Now hear me out. I'm not defending these salaries, but take our friend Albert Bourla of Pfizer in that bad 2023 year. He made 21.3 million, which is a lot of money. But the company, despite a 41% decline in revenues that year, still posted a reported net income of $2.1 billion. His salary for the year was less than 1% of that amount. Apple made $184 billion and paid Tim Cook $75 or so million. Comparatively, that's nothing. It's not surprising that boards, in the attempts to secure talented individuals, likely don't see themselves as being excessively extravagant when offering a $75 million package. Whether Tim Cook makes 50 or 75 or $150 million in the grander scheme of things really isn't something that makes a dent on a company that has a profit of $184 billion. So is it a problem? Personally, I think yes. Firstly, there's the more societal implication of some individual making 100 or 200 or 500 times more than an average employee. Many people, including myself, have a hard time reconciling the sheer imbalance in wages with their relative performance. Very few CEOs are putting in 200 times more effort than the average employee. Very few CEOs are 200 times more intelligent or experienced than the average employee. And very few CEOs create 200 times more impact than the average employee. And it just doesn't seem fair to many people. I also think back to the story of an individual called Niels Smedgaard. Back in 2007, he took over as CEO of a Danish company called Maersk. It's a shipping company. In 2011, he had heart complications that meant he was out of action as CEO for 5 months. In those 5 months, the stock market saw little to no reaction to his absence, as it was assumed that the company would be fine with the chairman of the board stepping in the interim. Now, obviously, this could be a consequence of the great leadership and structure that Smedgaard had put into place, but the reality is the business did fine without him. Could they have been rudderless forever? No, but their Lionel Messi went off the field and the team still did fine. Lars Fruergaard, the CEO of the firm behind Wegovy and Ozempic, Novo Nordisk, took over the reins in 2017. The active ingredient semaglutide was already making its way through FDA approval before he assumed the role of CEO. Fruergaard has steered the ship well, but he's not some demigod whom Novo Nordisk could never do without. A good CEO is like any other employee, incredibly important to a business. The CEO role is a crucial one and a challenging one. Not everyone can do it, but the elevation of the CEO to the status of indispensable superstar is just flawed. I spoke to a senior equity partner at a global consulting firm the other day, and his key takeaway was you can get far as a CEO by just avoiding screwing things up. If the business ain't broke, then don't try to fix it. To me, at least, there is an overemphasis on the value of the CEO as an individual, and I do have a hard time reconciling any individual's performance to a multiple of 200, 300, or 400 times that of an average employee's contribution. It elevates the CEO to a level of superstar, which often isn't justified. It over-exaggerates the importance of the individual and massively underrates the contribution of the organization as an entity. Not that it's going to change. Out-of-control CEO compensation has been discussed for at least 20 years, and nothing has really changed. My question to you is, what's the pay ratio of the CEO at your company, if you know it? And relative to the performance of the business and their contribution, does it seem reasonable to you? Or is it out of proportion? Share your thoughts in the comments. Have a wonderful day. Remember to like and subscribe. See you around.